Last time we spoke about the battle along the Wusong Creek. The situation was dire for the Chinese defenders, who faced overwhelming odds. Amongst the Japanese was one Okishima, a soldier who experienced the brutal reality of the war firsthand. Amidst the chaos, battles erupted along the Wusong Creek, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Chinese forces, despite being greatly outnumbered in terms of tactical superiority, demonstrated extraordinary resilience, fighting bravely even when retreat was necessary. As the battle raged on, tactics evolved. Chinese troops fortified defenses and implemented guerrilla warfare strategies. The soldiers transformed the landscape into fortification, turning abandoned buildings into strongholds. October brought a fresh wave of new violence. The Japanese pressed their attack, unleashing superior firepower that gradually saw them conquer Chiang. This episode is The Battle of Shanghai Part 6, the 800 heroes who defended the Sihang Warehouse. Hello again and welcome back to the Fall and Rise of China podcast. I'm your dutiful host, Greg Watson. But before we begin, I just want to remind you all that this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Perhaps you want to learn a bit more about the history of Asia? Kings and Generals has an assortment of episodes on the history of Asia and so much more. So go give them a look over at YouTube. So please subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And hey, don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and Pacific War Week by Week podcasts, both written and narrated by me. And if after all that you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War, my personal podcast found on all major podcast platforms. Over on Echoes of War, we're about to release a multi-part series covering the battle for the Philippines during World War II. If you'd like to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/PacificWarChannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, which is about 28 episodes and ongoing now. You get early access to all the content I make and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. And just a minor update, I released a new poll asking my audiences at my YouTube membership and my Patreon account if they'd like me to do something outside of history. It could be fantasy, sci-fi, current events. I mean, the world's your oyster. So if you want to hear my dumb voice talk about something different, well, please go check it out. Before the fall of Chiang, despite the threat of court-martial for anyone abandoning their posts, a general withdrawal of all Chinese forces in the Jiangwang salient was already in progress. As early as the night between August the 24th and the 25th, the divisions within the salient had been ordered to move their baggage trains and support services back southwest across the Suzhou Creek, utilizing the Zhongshan Bridge and the Jesfield Railway Bridge. As the fighting intensified north of Jiaibei, in the subsequent days, the flows of soldiers, vehicles, and pack animals continued. By the night between October the 26th and the 27th, the Chinese completely vacated the metropolitan Shanghai area north of Suzhou Creek. A foreign journalist wrote, "The enormous Chinese army simply melted away, and at dawn the Japanese found themselves facing empty positions. The two armies were no longer in contact." During the retreat from Jiaibei, the Chinese systematically set fire to thousands of shops and homes, implementing a scorched earth policy. At 7 a.m. on October the 27th, 8 narrow columns of smoke cut across the horizon from one end of Jiaibei to the other. 2 hours later, these columns had transformed into, quote, huge black pillars stretching towards the azure sky. By the afternoon, a massive wall of smoke stretched for miles long, rising thousands of feet into the air. In the words of a German advisor, "It was a fire of unimaginable extent that raged out of control for several days, repeatedly threatening to spill into the international settlement." Refugees who had left Jiaibei weeks or months earlier, hoping to return now that the fighting seemed to be over, were devastated to see their homes consumed by the sea of flames. The Japanese army, or specifically the doctrine guiding them in the field, failed in two significant ways by allowing some of the Chinese best divisions to escape the trap that they had set for them. First, on the evening of October the 26th, after taking Chiang, the Japanese columns could have advanced across Jiaibei right to the edge of the international settlement. Instead, they followed orders and ceased their advance at the line they had reached at sunset. As German advisor Borchardt wrote, "The only explanation for this lack of independent thinking amongst junior Japanese commanders and their fear of deviating even slightly from a meticulously detailed attack plan. Since the Japanese focused on rallying and reorganizing their forces after the fall of Danchang, they missed an opportunity for a victory so decisive that the Chinese would have been forced to give up their continued resistance in Shanghai. If the Japanese made their first mistake by leaving a door open for the enemy to escape, they committed a second error by failing to notice that the enemy was using said door. Although Japanese reconnaissance planes monitored the two main bridges utilized by the Chinese to retreat, and even deployed parachute flares to detect movements at night, they inexplicably failed to observe the Chinese withdrawal. The retreat was executed precisely as planned, with every piece of artillery withdrawn. This allowed the Chinese to occupy prepared positions south of Suzhou Creek and around Nanxiang, enabling them to continue the fight another day. Despite their missteps, the Japanese initially celebrated their conquest of Jiabei as a victory, placing thousands of small rising sun flags throughout the district's ruins. Amidst a sea of white and red, the only relatively intact structure was the Four Banks Warehouse, known as the Sihang Warehouse. Starkly reminded the Japanese that the Chinese still maintained a foothold north of Suzhou Creek. Rumors began to circulate that the soldiers inside had vowed to fight to the death. The Japanese came to realize that their triumph in Jiabei would be perceived as flawed and would even resemble a defeat as long as the warehouse remained in Chinese hands. Now, it was back on October the 26th, Chiang Kai-shek had ordered all forces in Shanghai to withdraw to the western rural area. To facilitate a safe retreat, a rearguard was necessary, as is standard in military withdrawals. Chiang Kai-shek issued orders to General Gu Zhutong, the acting commander of the 3rd Military Region, to leave the 88th Division behind, not only to buy time for the retreating forces, but also to stage a final grand stand in front of the Shanghai International Settlement. This was a last-ditch effort to gain international support, as the 9 great powers were set to convene on November the 6th. However, General Gu Zhutong was personally attached to the 88th Division, and thus reluctant to abandon them. It's worth noting that he was acting commander in this position because his next post was to lead the 88th Division. Therefore, he telegrammed the divisional commander at the time, General Sun Yongliang, who was opposed to the plan to leave the 88th Division behind. While neither Gu Zhutong or Sun Yongliang were willing to disobey orders from the Generalissimo, Sun proposed a solution. They could leave a portion of the troops behind, just not the entire 88th Division. In his words, "How many people we sacrifice would not make a difference. It would achieve the same purpose." Sun suggested leaving behind a single regiment from the 8th Division to defend 1 or 2 heavily fortified positions. Gu Zhutong agreed to this plan, and at the time the 8th Divisional headquarters was located at the Sihang Warehouse. The Siang Warehouse is a 6-story concrete building situated in the Jiabei district just north of Suzhou Creek, at the northwestern edge of the new Lesi Bridge. The warehouse was constructed collaboratively by 4 banks, hence the name Sihang, which translates to 4 banks. Directly across the Suzhou Creek lies the Shanghai International Settlement, a neutral territory where Western foreigners resided. The fighting would occur literally just across the creek, forcing Western observers to witness the heroic last stand that China would make in Shanghai up close and personal. For those who might not be aware, there is an outstanding film titled The 800. I even reviewed the movie on my personal channel, the Pacific War Channel. The film excellently captures a remarkable situation depicting an extravagant city on one side of the river, filled with entertainment, casinos, bars, and restaurants. The international community enjoys their vibrant lives full of colors and lights, while on the other side lies a literal war zone. The Siang Warehouse stands there, bullet-ridden, as the Japanese continuously attempt to storm it against the Chinese defenders. It's a very compelling film, and it's worth checking out. Feel free to take a look at it, and if you have a chance, why don't you check out my review. Now, returning to our story, Sun Yongliang reconsidered and believed that leaving an entire regiment was a little excessive. Instead, he opted to leave behind an overstrength battalion. The 1st Battalion of the 524th Regiment was chosen for the task. A young colonel, Shien Yuan, who was also new to the 88th Division, volunteered to lead the battalion. No one who had met Shien Yuan could doubt that he was the ideal choice to lead the battalion that would stay behind, holed up inside the Siang Warehouse in the corner of Jiabei, demonstrating to both the domestic and international audience that China remained resolute in its resistance against Japanese aggression. The 32-year-old graduate of the elite Central Military Academy, who had been stationed in Shanghai with the 80th Division since the hostilities began in August, was a soldier to the core. He stood out straight as a bayonet, and according to a foreign correspondent who met with him, even while wearing a mask, he was unmistakably a military man. In the correspondent's words, he represented modern China stripped for action. Upon receiving his assignment on the night of October the 26th, Shien Yuan went directly to the warehouse and he was pleased with what he found. It resembled a virtual fortress. Each of its walls was pockmarked with numerous rifle slots, ensuring that attacking infantry would face a barrage of fire from the building's well-defended positions. It was evident that once the Japanese arrived, they would surround the structure on three sides. However, a link remained to the international settlement to the south across the Lessie Bridge. British forward positions were as close as 40 feet away, and with careful maneuvering and a bit of luck, it was likely that the injured could be evacuated under the cover of darkness. From a tactical standpoint, it was an ideal location. Still, improvements were possible, and Xie ordered the soldiers already present to work through the night to enhance their defenses. They had an ample supply of large bags filled with wheat and corn at their disposal, which served as excellent substitutes for sandbags. Shien Yuan's first challenge was to rally the soldiers of the 524th Regiment's 1st Battalion to occupy the warehouse positions. This was a complex task, given the short notice, as the companies and platoons were scattered throughout Jiabei, and some had unknowingly begun moving west with the rest of the Chinese army, unaware of the orders that their battalion had received. Throughout the night, Xie and his second-in-command, Yang Rufu, dispatched orderlies through the blazing streets in search of their men amidst the throng of retreating soldiers. Eventually, their efforts bore fruit. By 9 a.m. on October the 27th, the last remaining soldiers of the battalion arrived at the warehouse. By then, Shien Yuan's force consisted of just over 400 officers and soldiers. This was a minuscule number compared to the might of the Japanese military that they were immediately put to the test. Xie was unfamiliar with the men under his command, effectively being thrown into the deep end, so to speak. The location chosen for their stand was, of course, the Siang Warehouse. The 1st Battalion originally comprised 800 men, but casualties incurred during the Battle of Shanghai had reduced their numbers to just 452. Each soldier was armed with either an Hanyang 88 or a Chiang Kai-shek rifle, an 8mm Mauser, grenades, a German M1935 Stahlhelm, a gas mask, and they had some Czech ZB VZ.26 light machine guns, along with 4 Type 24 Maxim guns. They would be facing off against the force of the 3rd IJ Division, commanded by General Iwani Matsue, as well as the 10th Battalion, the 8th and 9th Companies of the Shanghai Special Naval Landing Forces under Captain Okuchi Denshichi. The Japanese forces were further bolstered by approximately 260 sailors from the Yokosuka 2nd Independent SNLF Company and another 200 sailors from the Kuri 1st SNLF 2nd Company. Additionally, the 8th and 9th Companies of the Shanghai SNLF, originally attached to the 4th Artillery Battalion, would provide support with howitzers and mountain guns. In total, around 980 infantrymen from the reinforced 10th Battalion of the Shanghai SNLF, along with another 200 artillerymen from the 8th and 9th Companies, were involved in the Japanese assault upon the Siang Warehouse. Shien Yuan consolidated his battalion's defenses inside the Siang Warehouse, believing it would provide his men the highest chance of holding out for as long as possible. He correctly assessed that the Imperial Japanese Army would be unable to use their heaviest artillery, aerial bombardment, gas attacks, or naval guns for fear of accidentally striking the international settlement. It's important to remember that this was 1937, and the Empire of Japan was not willing to risk open warfare with the Western nations until 1941. What the Japanese did have access to were armored vehicles, such as Type 94 tankettes. The Japanese infantry were equipped with various weapons, including Atasaka Type 38 rifles, Type 11 and Type 96 light machine guns, the Nambu Type 14 pistol, Type 92 heavy machine guns, Type 97 grenades, Type 89 grenade dischargers, and a Type 93 flamethrower. On October the 27th, various companies of the battalion reached the Siang Warehouse after a fighting withdrawal. By this point, they numbered about 414 men, who essentially volunteered for a suicide mission, and were later acknowledged by Chiang Kai-shek for their exemplary soldierly conduct. The 1st Battalion was commanded by Army Major Yang Rufu, and their forces included the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd Companies, as well as a machine gun company, totaling about 452 men, once the remaining soldiers arrived. Due to 2 months of intense fighting in Shanghai, many of the German-trained elite troops had been killed or wounded, leaving the majority of the reinforcements at the Siang Warehouse to be garrison troops from the surrounding provinces. Many of these soldiers came from the 5th Regiment of the Hubei Provincial Garrison, which meant that they were inexperienced recruits. On the 27th, news began to circulate throughout Shanghai that the Chinese forces were still resisting the Japanese in the Jiabai district at the Siang Warehouse. At around 4 a.m., a girl guide named Yang Humin approached a British guard at a post at the Chinese end of the New Lissy Bridge, where she noticed a British soldier tossed a pack of cigarettes into the warehouse. Yang asked the soldier what he was doing, and he informed her that there was a battalion of Chinese soldiers inside. She then wrote a message and requested that the soldier place it inside a cigarette box and toss it over. Soon the Chinese tossed back the cigarette box with a message indicating they needed food, ammunition, and lubricant for their weapons. Yang then left the bridge and began pleading for help at the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce, but no one believed her story. Shien Yuan deployed the first company led by Captain Tao Xingchun on the right side of the warehouse along Tibet Road. The third company, led by Shu Meihao, was stationed on the left across from the bank of the communications building, while the second company, commanded by Deng Ying, held the other side. 2 heavy Type 24 Maxim machine guns were mounted on the roof of the Siang Warehouse, with additional machine guns distributed to each company. A forward platoon from each company was sent out to provide early warning of an enemy attack. Furthermore, Shi ordered his combat engineers to place remote detonated charges in front of the warehouse. These units were strategically dispersing rifles and machine guns throughout the warehouse and the rooftop. They reinforced the building with bags of sand, corn, and beans, and they erased surrounding structures to create a deadly killing field. At 7:30 a.m., an advance outpost reported seeing Japanese Marines near the North Train Station. 45 minutes later, it confirmed that the enemy's flag was flying over that building. The Chinese soldiers were ordered to engage the advancing IJ 3rd Division, and over the next 2 hours they executed a fighting retreat back to the warehouse. A brief pause ensued, during which the Chinese defenders prepared themselves, with some taking up positions on the various floors of the warehouse and others crouching behind an outer wall surrounding the building. At 1 p.m., a Japanese column approached the warehouse, confidently marching down the middle of the road behind a large rising sun banner. It appeared more like a victory parade than a tactical maneuver. Once they were in range, the Chinese officers ordered their men to fire. 5 Japanese soldiers fell immediately, causing the rest of the column to scramble for cover. Within an hour, the Japanese had amassed enough troops to attempt a storming assault of the warehouse. A sizable force surrounded the building, unleashing so much firepower that the Chinese were forced to abandon the outer wall and retreat to the warehouse itself. Although the defenses remained solid, the crisis was far from over. The attackers appeared to be gaining dangerous momentum. The first bloodshed occurred when 10 IJ soldiers were killed while attempting to secure fortifications around the warehouse that had been rigged with explosives. At 2 p.m., a National Revolutionary Army platoon, led by Yin Chi-chung, exchanged fire with approximately 50 Japanese troops. By 3 p.m., an IJ company consisting of around 194 men launched an attack on the warehouse from the west. During this engagement, the 3rd Company commander, Shu Meihao, was shot in the face, but he continued to lead the defense until he was shot again in the leg. Meanwhile, about 70 IJ soldiers took cover in a blind spot just southwest of the warehouse. In response, the Chinese climbed atop the roof and threw grenades at the Japanese, killing 7 and wounding 20. The initial assault by the Japanese was a complete failure, prompting them to set fire to the northwestern section of the warehouse, where fuel and lumber were stored. By 5 p.m., firefighter efforts had extinguished the blaze, as the Japanese were preoccupied with looting the Jiabai area. It was at this point Yang Rufu commanded a dozen soldiers to rush to the roof and lob hand grenades at the Japanese forces below. This counterattack halted the Japanese advance. As the Japanese were withdrawing, they left behind 7 dead. Much of the fighting was closely watched by excited Chinese on the other side of the 60-yard Suzhou Creek. Each time news spread of another Japanese soldier being killed, a triumphant cheer erupted from the crowd. At around 9 p.m., Yang Rufu assessed that there would likely be no further Japanese attacks that day, and he ordered his soldiers to repair the fortifications and eat their meals. However, no one would sleep that night. The Chinese suffered 2 deaths and 4 wounded, while the Japanese reported about 17 dead and 20 wounded. Foreign correspondents witnessed the battle from the safety of the Suzhou Creek, enjoying a front-row seat to the harsh reality of urban combat. One reporter observed a small group of Japanese soldiers cautiously approaching the warehouse, navigating through broken masonry and twisted metal. Crawling from cover to cover, it took them about 50 minutes to traverse just 50 yards. The Chinese defenders, watching from concealed vantage points, had been monitoring their movements the entire time. Once the Japanese party was close enough, the defenders unleashed a barrage of hand grenades. After the dust settled, they used their rifles to finish off anyone who was still able to move. Several Japanese attempted to rescue their wounded comrades, but they were also killed. It was a war without mercy. Even after darkness fell over the warehouse, there was no time for sleep. The soldiers worked tirelessly to repair damages and reinforce their positions. The next morning, Shien Yuan contacted the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce for assistance, having received their phone number from Yang Humin. At about 7 a.m. on October the 28th, Japanese bombers began to circle the warehouse but refrained from dropping any bombs for fear of hitting the international settlement. Surrounding the rooftops of nearby buildings was a sea of rising sun flags, serving to intimidate the Chinese and signal that they were encircled. By 8 a.m., Shien Yuan delivered a pep talk to the defenders and noticed a Japanese squad advancing along the Sujiao Creek. According to Yang Rufu's memoirs, Xie picked up a rifle and he shot one of the Japanese soldiers from over a kilometer away, halting the squad's advance. At 3 p.m. that day, it began to rain as the Japanese launched a major attack on the west side of the warehouse, taking control of the Bank of Communications building. From there, they deployed machine guns and cannons to bombard the north face of the warehouse. However, the cannons were unable to significantly damage the 6-foot-thick walls, and the Japanese troops in the bank building were easily suppressed by defenders on the warehouse's roof, who enjoyed a superior vantage point. After 2 hours of fighting, the Japanese gave up on the attack, but managed to cut electricity and water to the warehouse. Yang Rufu ordered strict rationing, with each company placing its water reserves under guard, and collecting urine in large barrels for firefighting purposes if necessary. Witnessing the fierce Chinese resistance, the Shanghai Chamber of Commerce was invigorated, and news of the stand quickly spread via radio. Crowds of over 30,000 people gathered along the southern bank of the Sujiao Creek, cheering the defenders on. In response, 10 truckloads of aid were donated by the Shanghai citizens, making their way over the bridge to the warehouse throughout the night. The defenders received food, fruit, clothing, utensils, and letters of support from the citizens. A few journalists attempted to visit, but due to the commanding officers being busy, they only managed to meet with Lei Zhong, the machine gun company commander. Shien Yuan had utilized the same trucks to transport 10 wounded men back to the international settlement. During these truck transit actions, 3 Chinese soldiers were killed by Japanese sharpshooters. Yang Humin courageously ran to the warehouse to personally deliver a Republic of China flag to Shien Yuan. Upon receiving the flag, Xie was asked by a reporter about his plans, to which he simply replied, "Defend to the death." Yang Humin then requested a list of the soldiers' names to announce to the entire country. However, Xie was reluctant to provide this information, fearing it would reveal his actual numbers, and prompt the Japanese to storm the warehouse. Instead, he wrote down 800 names from the original 524th Regiment's roster, and thus the legend of the 800 heroes was born. The next morning, the Republic of China flag was hoisted on a 13-foot pole atop the Siang Warehouse. Since Yang Humin had only delivered the flag without a pole, the defenders constructed a makeshift pole using 2 bamboo combs tied together, holding a flag-raising ceremony. Crowds gathered in the international settlement, reaching up to 30,000 in number, shouting, "Zhonghua Mingguo Wansu! Long live the Republic of China!" Japanese aircraft attempted to destroy the flag with strafing fire, but they were unsuccessful. They were forced to retreat due to anti-aircraft fire. At noon, the Japanese launched their largest offensive to date, attacking the warehouse from all directions with Type 94 tankettes and cannons. The 3rd NRA Company was pushed out of the defensive lines to the base of the warehouse and then further into the warehouse itself. The Japanese cannon fire chipped away at the warehouse structure, creating new firing ports on the windowless west wall. The Japanese attempted to scale the walls to the 2nd floor using ladders. Shien Yuan was positioned near a window when 2 Japanese soldiers managed to climb into the 2nd floor beside him. He reportedly choked the first soldier to death and shot the other while kicking over the ladder that they had used. The situation became dire as a platoon of Japanese soldiers began placing explosives to breach the west wall. As the battle raged on, a Japanese platoon continued planting explosives at the base of the west wall in an effort to breach it. When the Chinese defenders noticed what they were doing, 21-year-old Private Chen Shisheng, armed with a grenade vest, jumped from a 2nd-story window onto the Japanese platoon that was planting the explosives. His suicide attack killed himself and 20 Japanese soldiers below. If you haven't seen the movie The 800, I strongly recommend it for this scene alone. It is harrowing. The fighting continued until darkness fell, with waves of Japanese soldiers storming the warehouse using armored vehicles. Ultimately, the Japanese had to abandon their assault, and they began digging a tunnel towards the warehouse with an excavator. In response, posters emerged in the international settlement showcasing the movement of the Japanese to the Chinese. At 7 a.m. on October the 30th, the Japanese recommenced their attacks, this time employing heavy artillery, firing approximately 1 shell per second throughout the day. The Chinese responded by reinforcing the warehouse with additional sandbags. As night approached, the Japanese utilized floodlights to illuminate the warehouse, allowing the artillery fire to continue unabated. Despite the overwhelming firepower, the defenders still managed to destroy some of the Japanese armored vehicles. The international settlement exerted pressure on the Japanese to cease the artillery fire, as it was dangerously close to their area. They informed the Japanese that they would attempt to persuade the Chinese to end their defense. A petition was sent to Chiang Kai-shek to stop the fighting for humanitarian reasons. Now, by this point, the defense of the Siang Warehouse had accomplished all of its objectives. The NRA forces in Shanghai had successfully redeployed to more favorable positions in the rural west. Moreover, the defense of the warehouse had garnered significant attention from the Western world. Consequently, Chiang Kai-shek authorized a retreat. Chiang Kai-shek ordered the battalion to retreat into the foreign concession and then to rejoin the 88th Division, which was now fighting in western Shanghai. A meeting was arranged with the British General Telfer Smollett and Yan Hu, the Shanghai Auxiliary Police Commander, to facilitate the retreat. The 524th Regiment would retreat to the international settlement by crossing the New Lesi Bridge. The 3rd Japanese Divisional Commander, Matsuo Iwane, was notified of this plan, and he agreed, promising to allow the defenders to retreat unharmed, although he would ultimately not fulfill this promise. At about midnight on November the 1st, Shien Yuan led the retreat of 367 men out of the warehouse and across the New Lesi Bridge into the international settlement. 10 Chinese soldiers had been killed, and 27 were far too wounded to move. Those soldiers volunteered themselves to stay behind and man some machine guns on the rooftop to provide cover fire. During the crossing, 10 additional Chinese soldiers were wounded by Japanese sharpshooters. But by 2 a.m. on November the 1st, the retreat was complete, marking an end of the defense of the Sihang Warehouse. After the battle, Shien Yuan reported that more than 100 Japanese troops had been killed by the defenders. Commander Sun Yanliang stated, "Enemy corpses in the vicinity of the Siang Warehouse total approximately 200. Commander Shi Jimin claimed, "More than 200 enemy troops were killed and countless others were wounded. 2 enemy tanks were destroyed and 2 more were damaged. The number of enemies was based on the daily counts obtained by observation posts." The Chinese had suffered 10 deaths and 37 wounded, while the Japanese incurred an estimated 200 killed, along with several more wounded. However, a Japanese report indicated that after the SNLF 10th Battalion stormed the Siang Warehouse, they would find about 80 Chinese corpses. As of 2022, historians now estimate that 377 Chinese soldiers managed to retreat, suggesting the actual death toll for the Chinese was likely about 33. The battle for Shanghai was arguably unwinnable for the Chinese from the outset. It was only a matter of time before the Japanese would gain the upper hand due to their material and technological advantages. As the fighting dragged on, with the Japanese capturing stronghold after stronghold in the countryside surrounding the city, the immense toll exacted on the defenders led to a growing number of Chinese generals questioning the wisdom of clinging to a city that was ultimately destined to fall. They pushed for a more comprehensive withdrawal rather than a tactical retreat from Jiaibei and Jiangwan that had already taken place. Otherwise, thousands more soldiers would die in vain. Moreover, there were serious concerns about morale taking a devastating hit, which could compromise China's ability to continue the fight. This was becoming a pressing issue. Chinese troops who had initially entered the battle with an upbeat and patriotic spirit gradually lost their fervor as casualties mounted in a seemingly hopeless battle. Once a division was reduced to 1/3 of its original strength, it was sent to the rear for reorganization and replenishment before being returned to the front line. Most soldiers perceived the odds of survival as heavily stacked against them. Despite regular visits to the front, Chiang Kai-shek remained largely unaware of these grim realities. Officers who understood the true conditions in the trenches were also familiar with the Supreme Commander's stubborn nature and his determination to defend Shanghai to the bitter end. Given the circumstances, they felt it unwise to reveal the full truth to him. This charade could not continue indefinitely. In some units, the situation was deteriorating so rapidly that it became increasingly likely soldiers would simply abandon their positions. With mutiny looming as a possibility, senior commanders sought to persuade Chiang Kai-shek that a complete withdrawal of all Chinese troops from Shanghai to a fortified line stretching from Suzhou to Jiaxing, a city about 35 miles to the south, was the only viable option. In early November, General Bai Changxi informed Chiang Kai-shek that the officers at the front could no longer control their men, and that a pullback would serve as a face-saving measure, forestalling potential rebellion within the ranks. However, nothing they said seemed to impress Chiang Kai-shek. General Li Zhangren, another officer who had previously attempted to advocate for a retreat, realized that arguing with the man at the top was futile. As he noted in his memoirs, war plans were decided by him personally, and no one else was allowed to say anything. Despite this, there were moments when Chiang Kai-shek appeared tantalizingly close to being swayed by the views of his lieutenants. As early as the first days of October, he seemed to favor withdrawal from the front, only to reverse his decision later. A similar situation arose late in the month when Chiang Kai-shek called a meeting with his frontline commanders in a train carriage at Shanghai railway station, southwest of Shanghai. Before his arrival, the generals discussed the battle and concluded they could do little against the enemy's superior firepower. Upon Chiang Kai-shek's arrival, Zhang Fuquei, the commander of the troops in Pudong, suggested moving 10 divisions to prepare positions further in the rear, where defensive measures would be easier than Shanghai. The majority agreed with this proposal. At this point, Madame Chiang Kai-shek made her entrance dressed in an expensive fur coat and fresh from a visit to the Shanghai front. "If we can hold Shanghai for 10 more days, China will win international sympathy," was what she said to them. She was vague about the specifics, but seemed to be referring to the upcoming Brussels conference. This declaration galvanized Chiang Kai-shek. "Shanghai must be held at all costs." He made the statement with firm conviction, as if it had been his sentiment all along. I would like to take this time to remind you all this podcast is only made possible through the efforts of Kings and Generals over at YouTube. Please go subscribe to Kings and Generals over at YouTube. You can help produce this content by checking out www.patreon.com/kingsandgenerals. And don't forget about our sister podcasts over at the Eastern Front and the Pacific War Week by Week podcast, both written and narrated by me. And after all that, if you're still hungry for some more history, why don't you check out my personal channel, the Pacific War channel found over at YouTube, and Echoes of War found on major podcast platforms. If you're looking to further support me, please consider checking out my YouTube membership or my Patreon account at www.patreon.com/pacificwarchannel. By joining either of these, you get access to the exclusive podcast series, early access to all the content I make, and voting rights for the subjects I will tackle next. As Chinese troops retreated across the Suzhou Creek, a small battalion under Colonel Shien Yuan held their ground, transforming the warehouse into a fortress. Despite fierce attacks, including artillery and tank assaults, they showcased unparalleled bravery. Reinforced by messages of support from the locals, spirits soared. Amidst mounting casualties, they persisted until a strategic retreat was ordered. As dawn broke on November the 1st, Shien Yuan led the remaining troops to safety, leaving behind a legacy of valor that inspired future generations. Thus, the 800 Heroes was born.